Welcome to this hot day's evening. Glad you all are here. I think you're troopers to be here. And this is a monthly talk lecture that French and Pickering Creeks Conservation Trust sponsors, along with Historic Yellow Springs, that provide this beautiful meeting place for us, historic and all. French and Pick has spent many years after Sam and Eleanor Morris created the organization, the nonprofit, to save open land, easements on property. And we save open land for clean water, clean air, habitat for birds and animals, all kinds of animals, and a better place to live for all of us, including the generations that come, because these easements are in perpetuity and what you see is what you get. So it's quite amazing. Way over 13,000 acres have been saved, and we work at it every day. So praise be. To know. I'm so glad. It's very important, very important. Tonight we have a special historic lecture. We've had a historic lecture since January in honor of the 250th, and you all got this wonderful, if you guys on Zoom were here, you would get this too, this wonderful booklet about the Declaration of Independence, going through the whole thing, who signed it, and the sort of steps that were taken in the summer of 1776. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have for this year. Our lecture tonight is when the Declaration of Independence was news. And I've been thinking about that for months. And I think it's a great way to consider the Declaration of Independence, because it was so startling. Imagine in Philadelphia, they would go, sure, this is what we have to do now. We're backed into a corner. Other people would say, oh, no, we can persevere. We can make it work. They'll come around, you know. And then out in the country, you've got people who are working on farms. They're working on businesses. They're working in furnaces and forges. Some have direct reward from the businesses they do from England and elsewhere, and some don't. Some just are living wonderful lives in the area and haven't even thought about it. So tonight we'll learn how these things happened. And our wonderful speaker, Dr. Emily Sneff, who has just written a book that came out in April called When the Declaration of Independence Was News. I happened upon it because I was reading the Wall Street Journal, and there was a review of her book. And I thought, oh, she has to come talk to us. So Emily is a Ph.D. from William and Mary. She's also a curatorial consultant for the Museum of the American Revolution and for historic Trappe, which is another one of our stellar places in the area. So please welcome Emily.
Thank you so much for the kind welcome. I'm going to speak loud for the folks in the room and hopefully not too loud for the folks on Zoom. I'm so pleased to be with you all. I've been on the road with this book for the past month, and I'm very grateful that my commute today was 25 minutes because I've been all over the place. But there is quite a bit to be said about the time when the Declaration of Independence was news in this area. This is where I grew up. The green spaces here are incredibly important. The historic spaces are incredibly important. If you haven't been to historic Trappe before, I would encourage you to do so, especially during this 250th year. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the book. I also have the book available for sale tonight for anyone in the room who may be interested. You just skip ahead. I like to begin, though, with the two images of the Declaration of Independence, which probably pop into your minds when I say those words. On the left, you see the signed parchment copy of the Declaration. And on the right, you see John Trumbull's painting called Declaration of Independence. These two images seem very straightforward. They're very iconic. You'll see them used a lot, especially during the 250th. Both of these images are, to an extent, lies. Let me explain. So first, I called the image on the left the signed parchment copy of the Declaration, but it's not. It's an engraving which was created in 1823. You can see the signed parchment on the right, and I promise this is a high-resolution image, but the ink has faded, and in fact, had been beginning to fade by 1823. And so that's why this engraving was created by order of the Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, to preserve what the handwritten copy of the Declaration with the 56 signatures looked like. And so the image that actually comes to our minds is not the parchment that you go and see in the rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Rather, it's this engraving. This is what you'll see on book covers, including mine, on movie posters. The Declaration font comes from this. So that's one level of sort of deception or misunderstanding with this image. Another is that at the top of the document, we have the date July 4, 1776, which would imply that the parchment was signed on that date, and that's not true. The parchment did not exist on July 4th. It was not created until later in July, and August 2nd was the day when signing of the parchment copy began. And so we have this sort of common misperception, which you will hear a lot in the next 6 weeks or so, that July 4th, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. You just got to take out those two words, and then you'll get back to the reality. And then at the bottom of the parchment, we have 56 signatures representing 56 men who were never in the same room at the same time. So if you have an image of your head of all these delegates lining up to sign the Declaration, that's not exactly accurate. And in fact, the men who signed the Declaration represented a mix of delegates who voted for independence, delegates who voted against independence, and delegates who did not even join the Continental Congress until after July 4th. You can see here an approximation of what the parchment would have looked like on August 2nd, the day when the majority of the delegates signed on it. And you can see I've crossed out the names of the delegates who were not in Philadelphia on that date. Now, for the most part, those names come at the bottom of their delegations. And poor Matthew Thornton is at the bottom right corner. He was actually a New Hampshire delegate. He should have signed after Josiah Bartlett and William Whipple at the top of that column of New Englanders. But on August 2nd, they had no idea that he would be joining the Continental Congress in November of 1776 and would want to sign. So Sam Adams just signed his name and didn't leave any space. One exception to signing at the bottom of a delegation or a whole column is the Virginia delegation. And you can see that below John Hancock's signature. In the Virginia delegation, the first signature that was added on August 2nd was Thomas Jefferson's. And he left space, plenty of space, above his name for two men to sign when they returned to Philadelphia, George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee, two of the sort of elder statesmen of the Virginia delegation. Wythe had been Jefferson's law mentor at William and Mary. So he left this room above his name. This is the same Jefferson who put author of the Declaration of Independence on his tombstone. But on August 2nd, he was leaving space so that he wouldn't be the first signer of the Virginia delegation. So much so that Carter Braxton's name is really squished in at the bottom of the parchment there. As for John Trumbull's painting, Trumbull worked on this for decades, trying to get all of the different likenesses. And if he captured any particular moment, it was June 28th, 1776. So this is not the signing of the Declaration. This depicts the drafting committee presenting their draft to John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. You can see the drafting committee in the foreground with Thomas Jefferson in his red vest and red hair presenting the draft declaration. But here too, if this is June 28th, we encounter some difficulties. First off, George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee, who we already established were not in Philadelphia during these critical weeks, they have front row seats in Trumbull's depiction of June 28th, even though both of them were in Virginia on that date. And then in the back, sort of looking up at an angle, you can see Charles Carroll. He was one of Maryland's delegates. He is remembered for being the only Catholic signer of the Declaration and also the longest lived signer. He outlived both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. He was not elected to the Continental Congress until July 4th. So he was definitely not in Philadelphia on June 28th. My purpose in starting with these iconic images is to suggest one of the key themes of the book, which is that publishing the news of independence to the world was messy work, much messier than these clean-cut images would suggest. And I mean messy in two senses of the word. First, there's a material messiness. There's a reason why there's ink splatters on the cover of the book. There's ink splatters on copies of the Declaration. There's grimy fingerprints. There's typos. There's really not white paper because this was rag-made paper at the time, and the whiteness of your paper depended on the whiteness of your rags. And in wartime, you were using those rags until they had no life left in them. There's also a messiness in terms of efficiency of communication. The Continental Congress tried to communicate the Declaration broadly, but they failed in a sense, especially diplomatically, and things did not go as smoothly as you might expect for a document that has had the staying power of the Declaration. So I hope that you'll get a sense of both of these kinds of messiness this evening. The timeline of the book stretches from May 1776, almost exactly 250 years ago. So if you want to read along with what happened in 1776, now's a good time to start. It goes through the summer and fall of 1776, all the way to January 1777. And the reason is that this is the period of time when the Declaration was news. Because in May, the Continental Congress first issues a resolution which is perceived by people both in Congress and outside of Independence Hall as a Declaration of Independence. And then January 1777, there's a particular printing of the Declaration, which marks the transition from when the Declaration was news to the Declaration as archival treasure, the way that we think of it today. The resolution which the Congress passed this week, 250 years ago, called for new representative governments in every colony. And some colonies had already taken this step. With the sort of assurances of the Continental Congress that, yes, this is the right thing to do. But now the Congress was saying, we all have to be on the same page. We can't have one of the 13 colonies that still has a royal governor, kind of in the mix. We all need to have new representative governments and get rid of the vestiges of British rule. And so this resolution was unanimously agreed to on May 10th. And then the Congress decided to add a preamble to it. And John Adams took credit for writing this preamble. And he got a little spicy with it. It's the first time when the Continental Congress actually blamed King George III for what the colonists were experiencing. Previously, they had been petitioning the king, asking him to redress their grievances, and now they're saying it's your fault. So this is a pivotal transition, which we see come to full effect in the Declaration itself. So the preamble to this resolution was not unanimously agreed upon. It was a split vote. And in fact, that experience of certain delegations voting against this important act and then feeling like they couldn't really vote for anything else in the Continental Congress because they didn't agree with that, this made the delegates feel confident that a vote for independence had to be unanimous. So this May 15th resolution is important in multiple ways, but it's not the only May 15th resolution. On that same day, by coincidence, I love coincidences of timing in the book. On that day in Williamsburg, the Virginia Convention voted to create a new constitution and Declaration of Rights for Virginia, and then also sent new instructions to their delegates in Philadelphia to propose independence, confederation, and treaties with foreign powers. So in one day, the Virginia Convention called for 5 documents, 2 of which were going to be drafted in Williamsburg, and then the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and Model Treaty would be the work of the Continental Congress. We see this change in Williamsburg reflected in the masthead of one of the newspapers there. All of the newspapers in Williamsburg had the same title. They were all the Virginia Gazette. Makes things very confusing. But this is Alexander Purdy's Virginia Gazette. And you can see this is the issue from May 10th, 1776. And in the masthead, we have the Royal Coat of Arms of Virginia. This is the masthead for May 17th, where the royal masthead has been done away with and replaced with 13 united colonies, united we stand, divided we fall. And within this issue, Alexander Purdy reported on the Virginia Convention's decisions of May 15th. So even though in Williamsburg, they're thinking about independence, they don't know about this decision that's been made in Philadelphia, pushing all of the colonies to have representative governments. And yet that sentiment is reflected here in this masthead with the sense that we have to all be on the same page. I like to think of the instructions that the Virginia Convention gave on May 15th as a to-do list for the Continental Congress. This is what they were working on, in addition to running the war and all of the other things that Congress had on their plates. This was their to-do list in June 1776. And it's helpful to think of it as a to-do list because although this is the order in which things appeared in the instructions to the delegates in Philadelphia, it's not necessarily the order in which things needed to happen. And so there's a great debate within Congress about whether independence should come first. And some of the people who we remember as being against independence, people like John Dickinson, one of Pennsylvania's delegates, I would argue were actually against independence first on this list. People like Dickinson are thinking, well, shouldn't we have something tying all of the colonies together, apart from just representation in the Continental Congress, before we separate from Great Britain? Shouldn't we let France know that we are planning on declaring independence before we actually do so? So there's this rigorous debate, and there's this sense of trying to understand what the people want. And these 3 documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Model Treaty, were being drafted simultaneously in June 1776. They were thought of as being completely intertwined with each other. And I mention this because it explains the Declaration. It was not meant to do everything. It was not meant to exist in a vacuum. It's essentially a press release explaining the decision to declare independence. But the work of actually creating a new government and creating a vision of what the independent United States was going to look like was left to the other 2 documents. Now, the problem with that is that these 3 documents were completed on very different timelines. The Declaration came first in 1776. The Model Treaty, which could be applied to different nations, was ready in 1776. But the first treaties did not go into effect until 1778. And then the Articles of Confederation took the longest because of the need for ratification. And so ultimately they're ratified in 1781, but they don't work and they're replaced with the Constitution. So that's why these documents have become sort of disentangled from one another. Here you can see the first printing of the Declaration of Independence. This is John Dunlap's broadside printing. It's a poster-sized sheet. And Dunlap's printing office was at the corner of 2nd and Market Streets in Philadelphia, so not that far from Independence Hall. And his team would have worked through the night of July 4th into the day of July 5th to print probably a few hundred of these broadsides to be sent out through official channels. John Hancock would have sent them out to each of the states, to George Washington, but delegates also sent them to friends and family members. This is the first printing, the first dissemination of the Declaration. And just to orient you to how the text appears on the page, you can see the first two paragraphs after that big initial W. I asked for an initial letter in my chapters in my book that big, and they said, we can't do that. I said, well, John Dunlap did it. But that's where we find the parts of the Declaration that are most familiar to us 250 years later. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's all up front. Then the longest part of the Declaration is also the part that we are the least familiar with 250 years later. That's the list of grievances about King George III, 27 of them. And then the final paragraph is the actual Declaration of Independence. That's where we have the resolution that marks the transition from dependent British colonies to the free and independent United States of America. Everything that comes before that final paragraph is essentially preamble. It could have looked different. It could have been longer. It could have been shorter. It could have been structured differently. And so we can give Thomas Jefferson credit as the principal author, the first person to put words on paper, for coming up with this kind of structure of a preamble, citing natural rights, a list of grievances, and then a final declaration. Because this was the start of a new genre. And many other independence movements and civil rights movements look back to this structure when they issue their own declarations. The first public readings of the Declaration took place in the greater Philadelphia area using these Dunlap broadsides on Monday, July 8th. And the reading that gets the most attention is the one for Philadelphia County, which happened outside of Independence Hall at noon on July 8th. The reader that day was John Nixon, who you can see here. He was the colonel of a battalion of Pennsylvania Associators. He also, by John Adams' account, had a really obnoxious voice. And in a time before amplification, maybe you need that guy with the annoying voice to do a reading for a crowd of what must have been hundreds, if not thousands of people. The reading should have been performed by the sheriff of Philadelphia County. The instructions were in Pennsylvania and other places for the sheriff to read the Declaration aloud. But for whatever reason, the sheriff gave the responsibility to Nixon. We tend to focus on the reader at these events. That's the name that gets remembered. And we lose sight of the audience. In the case of this reading outside of Independence Hall, one of the people in the audience was James Forten. And if you look at his dates, you will notice he was a child in 1776. He was 9 years old. He went on to become one of the most successful Black entrepreneurs in Philadelphia. He also was an advocate for abolition. And he remembered back to hearing the Declaration as a child, as this moment of inspiration. We can see how it impacted the course of his life. John Quincy Adams was also the same age in 1776. So there must have been children in the crowds who heard the Declaration read. It's an invitation to bring kids out to hear the Declaration read this year. There also were free Black people like Forten and his family. There were enslaved people. There were indentured servants. There were women. There were people of all different social classes. And in the case of the Philadelphia reading, at the other end of the block from Independence Hall was the Walnut Street Jail. So there were prisoners within earshot, including some people who had been imprisoned because of their loyalty to the king. Can you just imagine hearing the Declaration in that context? So these initial public readings are really informative. Another way that people learned the news of independence was through newspapers. And you can see here the first newspaper printing on Saturday, July 6th in Benjamin Town's Pennsylvania Evening Post. This was a really innovative tri-weekly evening newspaper at a time when most newspapers were printed once a week. He was really trying to get the latest information in front of his readers. From here, the Declaration was printed in every active newspaper in the United States, as well as newspapers on the other side of the Atlantic, which we'll get to in a moment. The Declaration was also translated within days of July 4th. This is a German broadside printing created by Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist in Philadelphia. And the Declaration was also printed in the biweekly German newspaper in Philadelphia. So if you didn't know, there's a significant German population in Pennsylvania at this moment, and they're politically involved. They want the same access to the news of independence as their English-speaking neighbors. And so this broadside and the newspaper would have given them that access. These printers did a tremendous job with the translation because they were steeped in the revolutionary language. They had translated Common Sense earlier in the year. They had been translating the words of the Continental Congress. They understood the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When the Declaration is translated into German in European newspapers, they're doing a word-by-word translation, and it's terrible. By comparison, you really gain a lot of esteem for these printers working in Philadelphia. Now, just to give you a sense of timing, only people in Philadelphia would have known about the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It takes days, if not weeks or months, for the news to spread. So within a few days, the Declaration would have reached the states surrounding Pennsylvania. About 2 weeks to get to Massachusetts and Virginia. It would have taken a month to travel overland to the southernmost colonies, because at this time there's British ships in the Atlantic. So it would have been quicker to send the Declaration on a boat from Philadelphia to Charleston, but you can't do that at this time. And it would have taken about 5 weeks for the Declaration to cross the Atlantic to London. I always get questions about George Washington, and since we're in Washington House, it feels fitting to talk about the man himself. George Washington received the news of independence on July 9th and immediately organized a reading of the Declaration for the Continental Army troops in Manhattan at 6 o'clock that evening. And he wrote this letter to John Hancock saying that the Declaration seemed to have the most hearty assent of the soldiers, the expressions and behavior, both of officers and men, testifying their warmest approbation of it. It's a great moment. The Continental Army gets clarity about what they're fighting for, and all the soldiers are cheering. The problem for George Washington is what happens later that evening, when the gilded leaden statue of King George III on the Bowling Green in Manhattan, sort of in the financial district, was tumbled down and beheaded and broken up into pieces. You can see the report in one of New York's newspapers here. This statue was, a symbol of the monarchy, and George Washington didn't necessarily disagree with it coming down. In fact, the lead from the statue was carted off to Connecticut. A couple of pieces survived, including the tail of the horse, which you can see here. But the rest of the statue was melted down and turned into bullets to be fired back at the British forces. Much better use of lead than a gilded statue of the old king. But the problem is that immediately reports start to swirl about who pulled down the statue. And we still don't know who. It could have been soldiers, it could have been civilians. But for George Washington, this event gave the impression of riot and want of order among the Continental Army at a moment when all eyes were on New York, because the Continental Congress had declared independence, but that was just words on paper. The Continental Army actually had to secure independence and win the war. So he writes that he doubts not the persons who pulled down and mutilated the statue were actuated by zeal in the public cause, but still he disapproves of the manner of the statue coming down. I mentioned typos, and so I just wanted to give you a couple examples of, as the Declaration spreads, how typos enter the situation. This is a newspaper that was printed in New Hampshire, and in one sentence you can see two homophones. We have the wrong than and the wrong to. Now, this could be a case of whoever was composing the individual pieces of type not being good at spelling. But I think it could also be a case of someone reading the Declaration aloud to the person composing the text. And so maybe they weren't looking at it on paper and weren't paying attention to which then or which to. So these kinds of typos may actually give us a clue about the process and the many people involved. The newspaper that has the highest proportion of typos is the Massachusetts Spy, which was printed in Worcester. For many years, the Massachusetts Spy had been run by Isaiah Thomas. He was a very skilled printer. He had literally written the book on printing in America. But he had turned control of his newspaper over to two men who were not very good at printing just before the Declaration. So Isaiah Thomas didn't get the chance to print the Declaration, and instead these two guys print it, and we can see the evidence of their work. In the famous second sentence, it says, "We hold these truths to us self-evident," instead of "to be self-evident." It also says they are endowed by their creatot instead of creator. And then in the final paragraph, it says the free and independent states. So these typos, speak to sloppiness, hastiness, but they wouldn't have impacted the reader's experience too much. Then we have clerks getting involved in the process. In Massachusetts, in particular, the official dissemination strategy for the Declaration required the town clerk to record the Declaration in the town minutes. And in some cases, they just folded up a printed copy of the Declaration and inserted it in the minutes. In other cases, they wrote out the Declaration themselves. And some of them really took some stylistic liberties. And in the case of the one clerk who you see here, made the title so thick with ink that it has since eaten through the paper. One particularly interesting story, and I'll share a couple this evening, behind a copy of the Declaration, is this broadside, which was printed in Boston. This was printed in mid-July, during a time when Boston was under a smallpox quarantine. So if you were in Boston at this moment, you had either had smallpox and were immune to it, or you were going through the inoculation process. And at this time, there was a thought that smallpox could spread through paper. So I have to assume that any broadsides printed in Boston stayed in Boston. This particular broadside is interesting because it's annotated. The list of grievances is numbered. Towards the end of the list, it loses track of the numbers. You see 25 and then 27 corrected to 26. We've all done that. And then at the bottom of the broadside, it's signed by Daniel Gould. And you may be thinking, well, who is Daniel Gould? I was too when I first saw this broadside. Thankfully, Daniel Gould left us a note on the back. This note, which he added sometime later, says, "I bought this when the Declaration of Independence was first celebrated in the year 1776, when I was a soldier in the American Army." Incredible. If we didn't have this note, I would have been looking for Daniel Gould's forever. But thankfully, because of this information and the fact that most of the Continental Army had moved on from Boston by this time, I was able to figure out which exact Daniel Gould had this broadside. And he was from Topsfield. He was a Minuteman. He had marched from Topsfield to Lexington and Concord in April 1775. And by this time, in July 1776, he was a lifeguard, a personal soldier to Major General Artemus Ward, who was the remaining officer in charge of all of the battalions in Boston. So that's why Daniel Gould was there when the Declaration was first celebrated in Boston. It's an incredible document, and it shows a soldier fighting for independence, sitting with the text and really processing each of the grievances about King George III. Staying in Massachusetts, on the other side of the river in Watertown, or I can say Watertown here. When I go other places, I can't say Watertown, but we get the first formal acknowledgement of the independent United States. And it doesn't come from the other side of the Atlantic. It comes from our indigenous neighbors. So the Declaration arrived in Watertown in the middle of treaty negotiations between the colony-turned state of Massachusetts and chiefs from the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq nations up in what's now Maine and New Brunswick, Canada. So they had come down to Massachusetts, and they were in the middle of discussing an alliance to fight alongside the Continental Army when the Declaration arrives. It's translated into French for the chiefs who knew that language and could further translate into the Algonquian languages. And one chief in particular, Ambrose Bierre, whose pictogram you can see at the top left here, he responds, "We like it well." That's the response that's in the treaty minutes. Whether that's actually what he said or not, we don't know. But those 4 words, "we like it well," that is the first acknowledgement of the independent United States by a foreign power. And it comes within 2 weeks of July 4th. The last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence was incorporated into the first paragraph of the Treaty of Watertown. And 3 of the other men who you see listed here, Peter Andre, Joseph de Nequara, and Sabattis Nequabwit, they all, in the middle of the treaty meeting, according to the minutes, jumped out of their seats. They were so anxious to go fight alongside George Washington. Now, this is an incredible moment in diplomatic history, but it's also an important juxtaposition to the way that Native Americans are described in the Declaration. Because the final grievance of the Declaration, and those of you in the room who pick up the handheld Declaration booklet can see for yourselves, it says merciless Indian savages. That's the description of our Indigenous neighbors. And so to have this moment of the Declaration being acknowledged and celebrated by Indigenous people is an important sort of counterpoint to that legacy within the Declaration. Another story behind the Declaration is actually on the walls of the Museum of the American Revolution right now. It was a great joy to work on this exhibit, The Declaration's Journey, at the same time that I was working on the book, and some of the things that are in the book came to life in the museum. You can see here Jonas Phillips, who was a Jewish merchant in Philadelphia, and a set of documents, including one of those Dunlap broadsides of the Declaration. Jonas Phillips tried to send one of the Dunlap broadsides to a relative and fellow merchant in Amsterdam in late July 1776. And he wrote this letter enclosing the Declaration. And I know for those of you in the room, it's hard to see on the screen, so let me zoom in. Is that better? Not quite. And that's because Jonas Phillips wrote this letter in Yiddish. So he wrote this intentionally. At one point he says, "I could explain my meaning better in English." So we know that he made this choice to write in Yiddish, a language that he knew and his correspondent knew, but anyone who would have encountered this letter in between would not know. And he sends the Declaration hoping to avoid British interception, but planning for it clearly. He sent the Declaration and this letter and 10 pounds for his mother through the Dutch Caribbean. He sent it to the island of St. Eustatius. We know it reached that island. It was marked by his contact there. And sometime after it left St. Eustatius, it was intercepted by a British ship. And so Jonas Phillips's Dunlap broadside has lived in the British National Archives in the intercepted papers of the Colonial Office ever since. And you can see it's stamped here, Her Majesty's State Paper Office. In fact, the British National Archives have one of the best collections of the Declaration because so many of them ended up in British hands. Now, this helps to inform the story of Silas Deane, who was the Congress's agent in France. He arrived in France in July 1776, and he was supposed to soften the ground for an alliance between the United Colonies and France. Silas Deane did not receive a copy of the Declaration of Independence from Philadelphia until November of 1776, by which time, as he writes here, it had indeed become an old story in every part of Europe. So what happened? How did the Congress drop the ball? How did Silas Deane not get a copy of the Declaration? Well, the Congress did send him one within a few days of July 4th, but it was thrown overboard. So the captain of the ship that was carrying this copy of the Declaration and a letter to Silas Deane was given instructions that if he encountered a British vessel, he should pitch this information overboard so it wouldn't be intercepted. The ship didn't even leave the Delaware River when it found a British vessel approaching, and over the Declaration goes. And so that's why Silas Deane is sitting there in Paris for months as the Declaration swirls in the news all around him. And I have a chapter in the book where he's writing increasingly angsty and bitter letters back to Philadelphia saying, "Do you not like me anymore? Do you not trust me? This is really a bad idea, guys. We're losing all of our public confidence here. So Silas Deane's a really interesting character in this period when the Declaration was news. Because the Declaration did not get to Silas Deane, and in fact, it wouldn't have mattered because British mail ships move faster than American ships trying to avoid British ships in the Atlantic. So the Declaration traveled on British mail ships from New York to London within 5 weeks. The Declaration was first printed in London on August 16th, and then from there, it spread across the English Channel to the rest of Europe. This is the first newspaper printing of the Declaration on August 16th, printed by Henry Sampson Woodfall in his Public Advertiser. He had actually warned his readers the day before that the Declaration would be in the next day's issue, and he printed the text in full. But that same day, the Declaration appeared not quite in full in Lloyd's Evening Post. And you can see here that certain references to the king have been replaced with long dashes. So that first sentence should read, "The history of the present king of Great Britain." This was a strategy because the Declaration is all about King George III, and that makes it a dangerous document to print in London. So certain printers employed these self-censorship strategies to avoid outright acknowledging the fact that the Declaration is all about the terrible things that the king has done. One of my favorite self-censorship strategies is in the St. James's Chronicle, where the printer actually changed the pronouns in the list of grievances from "he has," meaning the king, to "it has," meaning the British government, all of Great Britain. I honestly don't know. This would have taken an incredible amount of work. It's not just changing one word, it's changing the entire sentence structure. So this was a printer who was dead set on making sure that the Declaration was not about King George III. His name does not appear at all in the Declaration in this newspaper. However, there were also supporters of American independence in London, including the people who purchased this broadside, which we know was printed in London, and it bears the portrait of John Hancock as president of the Continental Congress. He has his little liberty cap and olive branches. And that's important as a reminder that at this time, no one associated the Declaration with Thomas Jefferson. His name was not on the final document as it spread. The only names that were on the Declaration when it was news were John Hancock as president of the Continental Congress and Charles Thomson as secretary. So when this London printer was looking for some sort of image to put alongside the Declaration, they turned to this engraving, which had first been printed in London in 1775, because there was so much curiosity about this merchant turned president of the Continental Congress. Now, as the Declaration traveled to Europe, the same self-censorship strategies that had been employed in London were copied and translated into other languages. You can see here this Dutch newspaper. There's asterisks and a long dash replacing those references to the king. And then the bracketed note there is another strategy that London printers employed, where they just skipped over the list of grievances and replaced it with a bracketed note saying, "Here, the colonists repeated their previous complaints. You know, we've all read them before. We don't need to print them again." It's a strategy for shortening the text, but also avoiding printing the worst stuff about the king. Unfortunately for Johannes Enschede, the printer of the Haarlem Courant, his readers actually wanted to see the list of grievances about the king. And so in the next issue of his newspaper, he had to print an apology saying, "I didn't know you wanted to see the middle section of the Declaration, so I'll print it now." But because he had censored the references to the king in the first place, in the first grievance here, he had to explain who he was. So in parentheses, he had to say, namely, the king. Now, I mentioned that the book concludes with a printing which marks the transition point from the Declaration as news to the Declaration as archival treasure. And this is that printing. These are broadsides which were created by Mary Catherine Goddard in Baltimore, because by this time, things were not great in the greater Philadelphia area, and the Congress had evacuated Philadelphia and was meeting in Baltimore. And so Mary Catherine Goddard was both the postmaster of Baltimore and one of the most established printers there. and they turned to her to create these copies of the Declaration, which have the names of all the men who had signed the parchment copy by that time. It's an important caveat because one man had not yet signed the parchment copy, Thomas McKean, one of Delaware's delegates. He signed sometime after January 1777, perhaps as late as 1781. And so his name was not on Goddard's broadside. And in fact, this kind of dogs McKean in his political career because his name is on some copies of the Declaration and not others. And he has to keep reminding people, yes, I really did sign the Declaration. These are just some of the stories behind this period of time when the Declaration was news. As I mentioned, for folks in the room, I do have a few copies available if you want to purchase the book. If you want to just get more information, you can click the QR code. And I also am doing a lot of events between now and July 4th and even after that in the area, and each one has a different flavor to it. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can go to emilysneff.com. And I would love to answer your questions. Thank you all so much. Any questions from folks in the room?
Wondering about, our interest is the Warwick furnace and the pots. And they were already by then very involved in trying to make cannon before the 4th of July.
Mm-hmm.
And what were their reactions, or did they receive news of this? Were they in Philadelphia?
Mm-hmm.
Or?
Great question. So the question for those online is about Warwick Furnace, the cannon makers in the area, the Potts family in particular. We know that one of the Dunlap broadsides was delivered to Pottsgrove Manor in anticipation of these public readings that were happening on July 8th. Whether that means that there was a reading in Pottsgrove or not, we're not sure. But remember, at this time, Montgomery County didn't exist. It was all Philadelphia County, and that's a big county. You can't expect everyone to head into Philadelphia to hear the news of independence. So it's certainly possible that there would have been a reading out in the area around Pottsgrove. But at the very least, the Potts family was so connected, and ironworkers in general, they have their pulse on, the how the war is proceeding. So they would have been in the loop. They would have been in correspondence, or they would have been subscribing to Philadelphia newspapers. So I don't know exactly when they would have found out about the Declaration. They're also, at this moment, anyone who's making war materials is looking at New York, where there's about to be a major engagement because there's a massive British fleet that's just arriving. So they would have been thinking about the Declaration of Independence in anticipation of that battle. Other questions? Yes.
Was there negative published about the Declaration of Independence? Was there backlash? And was that in any way visited upon the signers themselves?
Yeah. So was there negative news about the Declaration? Was there backlash, and was it visited upon the signers themselves? Great question. Within the U.S., the reporting about the Declaration is overall positive. There's a lot of reports about public readings and the celebrations that are happening. Not too many, essays sort of commenting on the Declaration. There are people who record privately their own feelings about the Declaration. My favorite is a teenager on Nantucket. Her name was Kezia Coffin. And when the Declaration was brought from Cape Cod to Nantucket, she wrote in her diary that it was horrible and that she wished that the Congress had been hung before they had been allowed to issue this Declaration. And at the end of her diary entry, she says, "The Lord reward them according to their words," which is just so ominous coming from a 16-year-old girl. But she's an interesting example because she stayed. We think of people who disagreed with the Declaration as leaving, being part of this loyalist diaspora, but she stayed. She got married. She stayed on Nantucket for the rest of her life. So there's certainly backlash within the U.S. I have a chapter in the book about Anglican ministers and how they reacted to the Declaration. Some of them, were forced to close their churches or leave the United States altogether. So they had some choice words for the Declaration. But in terms of negative news, we see most of that on the other side of the Atlantic. There's a lot of commentary and misinformation and rumors printed alongside the Declaration in London. One of the most sort of eye-catching ones is a reply to the Disunited States of America, which was printed in a London newspaper, which, much like the Declaration of Sentiments by the Women's Rights Convention in 1848, it uses the form of the Declaration to critique the content. So instead, this declaration is talking about how magnanimous the king is and how he couldn't possibly be a tyrant. So yeah, we see a lot of that in London, not as much here. Yes.
Did King George typically respond to the Declaration?
Did King George ever respond to the Declaration? There is a London newspaper that speculates about how he found out. And so I include that in the book because we don't know. The Georgian King's papers are all accessible to researchers now, and there's no smoking gun. There's no secret diary entry or letter or anything. But as this newspaper reports, and it was probably true, it was the Secretary of State for British North America who had to tell the king the news of the Declaration. Whether the king read it himself or it was kind of relayed to him, we don't know. I have a sense that the king at least knew the language of the Declaration because the one response that he sort of gives, a lot of his proxies are writing pamphlets, kind of defending him. But the king gives a speech at the opening session of Parliament on Halloween, where I get the sense that he knew what was in the Declaration, and not just the content, but the emotional language in it. So certainly he found out the news. He was one of the first people in Britain to find out, but we don't know exactly what he thought about it, and he was not able to respond. Responding to it would be acknowledging it, and the British, leaders had to basically operate as if nothing had changed, even though everything had changed. Great question. Yes. Yeah, so how much personal risk was there for the signers? And this dovetails nicely with your question as well, which I failed to answer the third part of. There's significant personal risk. The list of men who had signed the Declaration, the final line says they're pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And in some cases, that really was on the line. There's certain delegates who lose their estates, who's, when the British Army comes to town, their houses are the ones that are targeted first. People like New Jersey delegate Richard Stockton and some of the South Carolina delegates, they end up in British custody. They lose property. They lose their health. There's a lot that was at stake for them. Most of that comes later. In 1776, even through 1777, when the Goddard broadsides are printing, there hasn't been too much personal impact on the signers yet. But as the war stretches on, it becomes pretty significant. And there's an understanding that by signing their names to this declaration, they're signing up for that risk. So we can certainly think of them in that way, even though not all of them signed at the same time, and some of the delegates were not involved in the process for, debating or voting for independence. They still committed themselves to the cause. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious. What was the Royal Government of Pennsylvania doing? Why the Continental Congress even exists?
So
It's always fascinating.
The question is, what was the Royal Governor of Pennsylvania even doing to let the Continental Congress exist here? So it's all the Penn family. So because we are a proprietary colony and the Penn family is running things, it's a very different situation than in other colonies where you have an appointed royal governor. I don't think that the Continental Congress could meet in Massachusetts, for example, before they, kicked out their royal governor. in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is, a central location, so it makes sense as a meeting place. But I think there was also this sense of more freedom in Pennsylvania than in other places. That's not to say that the Penn family supported independence. They lost their estates because of it. But I think there was more flexibility in Pennsylvania. That said, Pennsylvania politics shift dramatically in the spring of 1776. There's an election in Pennsylvania on May 1st, which returns a majority of delegates to the Pennsylvania Assembly who support reconciliation with Great Britain. The conservative Quaker elites are still in charge. By July 8th, which is also election day in Pennsylvania, to elect people to a constitutional convention, that has completely gone the other direction. And now there's much more support for radical representatives. So I think Pennsylvania is a really interesting meeting place. But I think the Congress also had they were more comfortable here than they might have been other places that were not under that proprietary system, and would have had a little bit more oversight or questions from the royal governor of, why are you guys meeting here? It's a great question.
William,
Yes.
they met.
Until he leaves on a ship. After a certain amount of time, Lord Dunmore is evacuated from Williamsburg and is living on a ship. He does, but that he changes his mind pretty quickly. So yeah, great question. Yeah.
Leasing lease or military backing up their drawing?
So the question is, did the royal governors have any police or military authority backing up their authority? That's a lot of the content of the Declaration, that there's these British government structures that are in place that, all kind of build on one another. So having judges that are appointed by the royal governors or by the king, having, soldiers that are quartering in people's houses, having trial with juries that are on the other side of the Atlantic, like all of these things are an exercise of royal authority. And that's what we find in the Declaration. Great. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate you coming out this evening.